When you're driving a car, all you do is fill up the tanks with fuel and drive. There's not really that much planning that has to go into it, because the worst thing that happens is you run out of fuel, you pull into the side of the road, or you reach another fuel station and top up. When you're flying an aircraft though, there aren't many fuel stations floating around in midair though, so we have to be a little bit more careful with how we plan our fuel. So how do we plan our fuel, and how do we decide how much fuel we're going to take on any given journey? Let's find out. Hi, I'm Grant and welcome to the second class in the flight planning series. Today we're going to be having a look at how to plan and predict our fuel usage. That way, when we push back from the stand at the start of the day and get our engines going, we know we have the correct amount of fuel on board in order to conduct our flight safely. The fuel we put on an aircraft at the start of the day at the gate can be broken down into different parts. While not physically separated in the fuel tanks, it can be useful to think of these things as different containers of fuel, like jerry cans, bottles, containers, barrels, whatever you think is appropriate. For example, the taxi fuel is a small bottle of Coke that we use to taxi out onto the runway. We can then discard the bottle as it is now empty. We can then use the trip fuel, which is like a barrel of fuel. We only start tapping into once we start the takeoff roll. That's just a trick I use to try and think of these fuel amounts as completely separate and only used in certain situations. So whilst they're not physically separate, it can be useful to think of it that way in your head. So the breakdown of fuel that we have at the ramp is as follows. We've got the taxi fuel. This is pretty straightforward. This is the fuel used to taxi out to the runway. Depending on which runway it is, which runway's in use and which airport you're at, it might be a small amount. If you're somewhere with a runway miles away, it could turn out to be a lot of fuel. This fuel section, the taxi section, ends at the start of the takeoff roll down the runway. So our total fuel on board, our block fuel, our ramp fuel, minus the taxi fuel, is the fuel we would take off with, and that's what our takeoff fuel and takeoff mass would be based off of. So we're at the terminal, our plane pushes back, it gets pushed back by a little tow truck, and then we start the engines and we taxi down to the runway, and that's our little period of taxi fuel there. Trip fuel is pretty straightforward. This is the fuel required for the trip. It's the fuel needed to depart airport A, climb, cruise, descend and land at airport B, our destination. And it takes into account all the routing, any weather that we might have to, that we know about and we can avoid in terms of storms, or it could be things like headwinds and tailwinds that we need to think about. And it will also consider the type of arrival and approach that we're doing into our destination airport. The contingency fuel is something that we use for unforeseen circumstances that could increase the fuel burn on the trip. This could be things such as avoiding a thunderstorm that we don't know about in the planning phase. It can also be things such as increased fuel consumption due to flying at non-optimal flight levels, or different arrival departure runways from expected, and different routing as a result. Contingency fuel is 5% of the trip fuel, but there are a few special procedures we can use to reduce this amount further, which we'll look at after we've covered this breakdown. Additional fuel may be added depending on the type of flight. If we're operating to a remote airfield without a destination alternate, for example, then we have to add fuel into this alternate section to allow for 50 minutes of holding at 1,500 feet above the destination aerodrome. We would also see additional fuel added for something called ETOPS, which is extended twin operations. And ETOPS is basically a set of criteria in terms of maintenance, fuel planning, and in-flight procedures that you have to fulfill in order to fly a twin-engine aircraft across large bodies of water and further away from suitable destination, en route alternates, because the standard is you fly within 1 hour of airports as you would make your way down a route. But if you had 4 engines, it was a different rule. Because you had more engines, in case one went wrong, you'd still be able to fly further to reach a suitable alternate that's en route. But the ETOPS, the extended twin operations, allowed for 2-engine aircraft to fly further than 1 hour away from suitable en route alternates, basically because the engines were seen as more reliable. There was more careful planning going into it. ETOPS is not something I've ever done, but it's something you do if you probably cross the Atlantic or cross the Indian Ocean down to Australia or something like that. But I just know it requires a bit of extra fuel. Alternate fuel is the fuel we fly to the alternate with. This is the fuel from the missed approach of the destination, taking into account the full missed approach procedure and routing, then fuel to climb to a certain altitude, cruise for a little bit, descend and conduct an approach at the destination alternate. And there's a few extra things about alternate fuel that we'll again touch on in the future. We've then got final reserve fuel. This is our absolute last resort fuel. In a piston aircraft, we take 45 minutes worth of flight time, just generic cruise flight time. And in a jet, it's 30 minutes worth of fuel holding at 1,500 feet above the destination alternate. We use this because generally jets have a significantly different fuel burn when they're at low altitude compared to high altitude. So by using the 1,500 feet above the destination alternate for 30 minutes, it's going to be a very different number if we took 30 minutes of cruise flight time. And this is the more realistic situation. We're more likely to be holding at a low level than we are at a high level. So by taking 1,500 feet, that's probably a bit low in reality. You'd probably be holding a bit higher than that, but you still get a more realistic value for our fuel burn that we're going to need in our final reserve than if we used the cruise value for a jet. The final reserve fuel is not to be used unless it's an absolute emergency. If you enter into your final reserve fuel, you are in an emergency situation. You need to call Mayday and you need to land as soon as you possibly can, because this is possibly the worst situation, is running out of fuel in the flight. That's why we have this final reserve. It's for the absolute worst possible case scenario. If you go into it for anything other than a complete emergency situation, then yeah, you're going to get a call from your boss and maybe answer some serious questions. Extra fuel is anything extra that the captain wants to add. It's the commander's discretionary fuel. This is not a legal requirement like most of the other component parts, but this is just any extra fuel that the captain wants based on intuition and local knowledge. Say, for instance, you knew you were flying to London Heathrow. There's quite often a lot of delays going into London Heathrow because it's a very busy airport. Your company might factor in that they expect a 10-minute delay, fairly reasonable, but you know that it's 5 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon and that's when all the big flights arrive, so you're going to have to hold for a bit longer. You might think, right, we'll take an extra 10 minutes of fuel, so we've got a 20-minute holding fuel. So the flight plan doesn't legally have to calculate that holding time for you. So this is where you use that local knowledge, that intuition to help you out, and you just take what you need. So legally speaking, we have to take all those parts, but we can do a few little procedures to edit and change the amounts that we need, legally speaking. So the first one we're going to look at is the 3% contingency. So basically, if we reduce the amount of fuel that we take with us on a flight, then we can take more passengers and cargo with us. Think about the elements of our all-up mass that we looked at in the previous class. We've got the basic empty mass, and that can't really change. We've got the variable load, which that can't really change for a certain route. We need that amount of crew, we need that amount of food in the galleys, we need that amount of water in the toilets, that kind of thing. So the only thing we can really change are the fuel and the passengers for a certain route. Ideally, we want to take more passengers because passengers pay for the space. And fuel costs us money to burn. So if we can take less fuel, we can take more passengers, earn a bit more money from the flight. We can't just underfill the fuel tanks though and take too little fuel, as this would be dangerous and illegal. So there are a few procedures we can use to allow us, and the 3% contingency is one of those procedures. So the 3% contingency procedure, as you might expect, allows us to reduce the contingency from 5% of the trip fuel to 3% of the trip fuel. This is only allowed if there's a suitable en route alternate available, or an ERA, you might call it. If during the flight we see that there will no longer be enough fuel to land at the destination or destination alternate with our final reserve still intact, then we have this ERA as an option. So the ERA has to be in a specific location, which is within a circle that is 20%, with a radius that is 20% of the total flight distance, and the center of that circle has to be located 25% back from the destination. If we look at this picture between Madrid and Amsterdam, we can see that the ERA would have to be within this circle here, which is a 20% radius of the distance and is centered 25% back from Amsterdam. And I'm pretty proud of myself on this one because I just guessed two aerodromes that I thought would be, or two cities that I thought would be about 1,000 nautical miles apart, to make the maths nice and easy. And it turns out the Madrid and Amsterdam straight line is about 980 nautical miles. So that's I don't know, that's just a win for me. I thought I was quite proud of that. Anyway, you'd have to pick an ERA, which is within this circle. And you might pick one depending on what your company wants. So Paris has a few airports. It's got Charles de Gaulle sort of up to the north, and it's got Orly down to the south. Say the weather was good for both of them. Which one would you choose? Well, it really depends on what your company thinks is best. Say, for instance, you had a base at Orly, but not at Charles de Gaulle. It would make way more sense to land at Orly, because then you have all your own staff there. You might have extra planes there. You might have fueling contracts there, all this good stuff. You might have your own handling agents there. Whereas if you land at Charles de Gaulle, your company quickly has to phone up people, or you have to phone up people and sort things out, which could be a bit messy. So, for instance, on this flight, say our company had a base at Orly. Orly would be our en route alternate option, which would allow us to reduce our contingency to 3%, saving us a little bit of fuel, allowing us to put back more passengers and bags on should we need it. And there's another use for the 3% contingency fuel and these sort of fuel procedures in general. Say if we calculated we were going to be close to our maximum landing mass when we arrive at Amsterdam, or our maximum takeoff mass when we depart, then selecting a suitable ERA3 would allow us to reduce our contingency down to 3% and bring us back below those maximum structural masses or maximum performance masses. So the ERA3 procedure can be used for a couple things. Another procedure we can use is the reduced contingency fuel procedure. The reduced contingency fuel procedure is a way of giving ourselves two options for our destinations in a way. And we use the lower of the contingency fuel values. Basically, we nominate a suitable en route alternate that has good weather, approaches, it's not performance limited, etc. And we nominate a decision point. We then take 5% contingency from the decision point to the destination, or we take 5% contingency from the departure via the decision point to the en route alternate, and we take the larger of those two values and compare them. So it'll be either 5% contingency for this bit or 5% contingency for this bit. We have to take the larger of the two values, but there can be a significant reduction in fuel needed. Say, like this example, our decision point and our ERA is roughly halfway, then we'd only need to take 5% contingency for half the trip fuel to our destinations, which could be quite significant. So there's another procedure we can use that doesn't reduce the contingency, but it does mean that we don't have to take alternate fuel in a way. So it's called the predetermined point procedure, and it is basically used when the destination and the destination alternate are too far apart to fly all the way and fly down to our destination alternate as well. This can happen in really remote airports on remote islands, or even just remote parts of countries. For example, Perth in Australia is very far away from any other airports, so we might use the procedure. I don't know, I've never flown into Perth in Australia. But anyway, the procedure entails that we have a predetermined point along the route where we make a decision to commit to our destination or fly to our destination alternate. It's a fork in the road where we choose where we're going to commit. The predetermined point procedure is one where we don't use any alternate fuel, because alternate fuel is only used to fly from the destination to the alternate. Seeing as we're only going to one airport or the other, we don't use any alternate fuel. So we're saving a whole bunch of fuel on the alternate, but we do have to counteract and cover ourselves by taking some additional fuel in the form of this predetermined point procedure. Basically, we have two fuel values that we have to compare. We go from the departure via the predetermined point to the destination, and the departure via the predetermined point to the destination alternate. There's two routes. And we have to take fuel for either the departure to destination, and it depends on the aircraft we're flying. For a piston, for example, we take 45 minutes plus 15% of the flight time, or 2 hours, whichever is less. We then compare that to the fuel for this route here, and then we also take 45 minutes of additional fuel, and whichever fuel is larger, we take that one. If we were in a jet, we would compare the fuel for the departure to destination plus 2 hours of fuel based off of the cruise fuel burn, and versus the departure to the destination plus 30 minutes of holding fuel at 1,500 feet above the destination alternate, and we take the larger value there. You might have noticed that these two values sound familiar because these are equivalent to our final reserves. So you can think of it as taking 2 final reserves with you if you go to the destination alternate, or if you go to the destination, it's 45 minutes plus 15, or 2 hours, whichever is lower. So a little example of how we would use one of these alternate fuel procedures is something like this. So given the following information, calculate the minimum possible contingency fuel for a commercial transport flight from A to B with a twin jet aircraft. So it's a jet aircraft. We're thinking 30 minutes fuel at 1,500 feet above for holding. And contingency, so we're not looking at the predetermined point, we're looking at our 3% contingency, and we're looking at the reduced contingency fuel procedure. So we've got a true airspeed and a headwind, 450 knots and 50 knots. Fuel burn is 2,000 kilograms en route. Fuel burn in the holding is 1,200 kilograms. And aerodrome C is a suitable ERA, and that's halfway between 1,000 nautical mile distance. So it's all looking pretty easy numbers to work out. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try the 3% contingency procedure, and the very first step would be just to check that this is within the suitable radius. So we're going to go 25% of the way back. So that's going to be there. And that's going to be 250 nautical miles away from point C and 250 nautical miles away from point A. That would be the center of our circle. Then we take a circle which is 20% of the distance radius. So 20% of this is 200 nautical miles. So it's going to look something like that. That's going to be 200 nautical miles. And we can see that aerodrome C does not fall within that circle. So we know that we can't use the ERA3 procedure. So we're going to be looking at the reduced contingency fuel procedure. So we can assume that we've got a decision point, which is in line with aerodrome C. So we're going to either take 5% contingency fuel for here, or 5% contingency fuel to here, which is going to be the same number because this example is nice and friendly to us. So what we're going to have to do is figure out how much fuel we burn on half of the trip and take 5% of that. So fuel burn en route, 2,000 kilograms an hour. So we need to figure out how many hours we're going to be flying here, and we can do that because we've got speed and we've got a distance. Important to note though that point A to point B will be a distance over the ground, and we're looking at true airspeed and a headwind. So we can work out that we've got a ground speed that is equal to 400 knots because we've got the 50 knot headwind pushing us back. And then speed equals distance over time, so that's our speed, equals the distance, which is 1,000, over the time, and we can work out that if we're traveling at 400 nautical miles an hour over 1,000 nautical miles, the time is going to be 2.5 hours. That's what it would take to fly from A to B. Now we need to figure out that our fuel burn is what our fuel burn is going to be. I got tripped over my tongue there. So the fuel burn of 2,000 kilograms en route, 2,000 kilograms an hour en route, 2.5 times 2,000, that's going to be 5,000 kilograms. We then know that we only have to take 5% of either the first half or the second half. Well, doesn't really matter, so we're going to be taking 5% of 2,500, which is going to equal 125 kilograms. So that's our answer. We've double checked that it doesn't work for the ERA3, and our reduced contingency fuel is either 5% of A via the decision point to C, or it's 5% of C to B. And because this is conveniently located halfway, it's going to be the same. And 5% of half of the fuel trip burn, 125 kilograms. Nice and easy. So to summarize then, the fuel that we take on board can be broken down into different parts. We've got the taxi fuel, trip fuel, contingency, alternate, additional, final reserve, and extra. And the way to remember this is taxi, trip, cafe with 2 A's. So taxi, very simple, gate to runway. Trip, runway of A to runway of B. Contingency is 5% of this fuel value for the trip, or 3% if we've got a suitable en route alternate within a 20% distance circle, 25% of the way back. Or the contingency is 5% of not the total trip, but just the portion from the decision point to the alternate, or the en route alternate, or the decision point to destination. Alternate fuel is the fuel from the destination to our destination alternate, including all the missed approach, the arrival, the approach into the destination alternate and landing there. Additional fuel is taken for something like the predetermined point procedure. This procedure specifies that we pick a point where we create a fork in the road. We either go to destination or we go to the destination alternate. If we go to the destination alternate, we take an extra set of final reserve fuel. So in the propeller, that's another 45 minutes on top of our final reserve fuel. And in a jet, that's 30 minutes of holding at 1,500 feet above the destination alternate. If we go on to our destination, we take fuel for the trip plus an additional 45 minutes of fuel plus 15% of the trip fuel that we used, or 2 hours worth of fuel, whichever is more, and for a jet it's just a flat 2 hours worth of fuel. Final reserve fuel I just mentioned, it's 45 minutes for a propeller and 30 minutes of holding fuel at 1,500 feet above the destination alternate. And we don't want to go into that unless it's an absolute emergency. If you even touch it, you are in an emergency situation by definition. Extra fuel, this is commander's discretion fuel on the day, using local knowledge, local information, intuition, what you'd expect to see if you had a slot, like an air traffic control restriction. You can't depart for 2 hours, for instance, but you want to run the APU, the auxiliary power unit that's in the tail of the aircraft, to give the plane some air conditioning. You might add a little bit of extra fuel on here just to help cover that before you even start the engines and start burning this other fuel.